Hi everyone, welcome back. We are this week going to be working on an important chapter in our DataMesh book, and that chapter is chapter 5. So the finding really in chapter 5 is the topic is really critical, as you know, much of the book, but just really critical I'm finding as I'm trying to actually implement these kinds of ideas with my clients. However, I feel like the chapter has got a lot of repetitive concepts. And so I'm going to go a little bit faster, and then I'm going to try to weave in some information from my work with clients just to add a little bit more pragmatism. I'm focused on GCP, so I'm going to pause when we get to those areas because some of you have experience with other clouds. So I'm going to go ahead and start by screen sharing and just kind of try to capture the highlights from the chapter, and then obviously we always have discussion, so you know, invite your discussion as well. So let's get started. So let me do this and see if I can avoid yeah, there we go. Okay, can everybody see the book okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So like I said, this is a very long chapter, and I feel like the concepts are well covered, but the chapter could have been about half as long. So again, I'm going to go, you know, a little bit quicker than we normally do. The idea is governance, which is, you know, sort of a superset of security. And, you know, if you don't have security, you don't have really anything, right? So it's a really critical topic. And it's interesting, you know, she always starts with a quote, and the quote is about, you know, evolving, basically, seeing the whole and evolving, which easier said than done now, isn't it? So she starts by talking about, you know, embracing change, which for those of us that come from the data world, that's a really difficult concept because traditionally DBAs and people that are in charge of data are there because it's data should be constant, right? So again, it's easier said than done. She starts by talking about federated computational governance, which is global rules, which is not anything different than is regular data governance. The nuance is where and when you implement what type of governance. But she does start with kind of the traditional federated, which is, you know, top down, like these are our organizational policies. And she then talks about system thinking. Again, I think this is a bit abstract, which really wasn't too implementable in my opinion. And here's where she starts to get into the nuance of it, which is, I like the way this is written. Balance the state of the mesh between decentralization of domains, data domains, and their autonomy with global interoperability and just enough mesh level harmony. Boy, that's a mouthful. And it really, from a pragmatic point, is who controls what and how much. So you want to push some of the control down, but what control you push down and to which groups is the difficult part of this. It's very difficult because when you're moving from a federated model, which most of us start with, right? You have the DBAs. How do you push down some of the control? And the other aspect of this is this idea of constant change, which is very new in the world of analytic data. It isn't new in some other domains, I'll point out, like event-driven architectures. But in terms of data analytics, it's a newer concept, I think. So I really like this, where she talks about feedback loops, because, you know, if you're trying to make any sort of change in any system, you want to get feedback loops, whether, you know, it's tests in production code or whether it's end user feedback when you're creating new features. So that is a concept that I think is implementable. So she talks about feedback loops, and she recommends that the every data product is equipped with self-regulation, observability, and discoverability capabilities. And one of the things that I'm starting to see in the cloud vendors is this being pushed down to the service level. And I'm going to demonstrate that when we start, talking about how this works. I mean, just an example, maybe I'll just demonstrate it right now, actually. An example is typically, let me just switch, sorry, we have a little thing here. Typically, you would look at, this is Google Cloud, you would look at information about services, whether it's a database or a bucket or whatever it is, in a centralized logging system. That would be sort of the federated world, right? You would see the activity on, in this case, your project, and we haven't had very much, so it's not very interesting here. And you would then be able to query your logs. It would be centralized. Well, one of the feature sets that's being built into the data products, and I happen to work with the buckets quite a lot, are the fact that you not only can see the logs and summary of performance within the service instances, you also can get some new type of logging. And I haven't turned this on yet, but this is relatively new within GCP. I think some of the other clouds have had it longer. You can have actually inventory reports at the bucket level. And this kind of functionality is stuff that customers wrote before, but this is starting to be included at the level of the services for buckets. I think for databases, we've had this for a while, but in terms of data meshes, where we have a lot of data lakes, having the granularity of the feedback in the buckets and in the data lakes is a new pattern. So that was a lot of words to start with. I'm going to pause there and see if anybody has anything to add about their experience with this. No, nothing to add? Okay, I'm going to keep going.
Yeah, well,
go ahead.
I think as you said, like a lot of these things are starting to come together for data, which might have been there for other systems. Like I always think about observability. It's something that I've been like screaming about for like a really long time, like since I kind of am a software engineer first, and I was just upset by the fact that we didn't generally think about that in terms of data.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad it's highlighted here as like an important part of it, and becoming more built into some of the cloud products, and obviously like a whole ecosystem of products around data observability. So I like that she highlights it for sure.
Yeah, cool. Then she next goes into search and discovery, which we've explored a little bit in previous discussions about some of the new layers of metadata that are being made available in the data catalog products that are coming out. And then she talks about using these feedback loops to basically monitor the usefulness of the data products. I think this is a pretty modern idea. Like to contrast this, like feature microservices in a website. This has been around for a while, but in terms of data analytic products, this is a pretty interesting application of this kind of thinking that I think is going to take a bit of time for customers to understand, because the concept that the data analytics objects are dynamic microservices that you could combine, you could obsolete, just like features on a website. If you do A/B testing, is relatively new. This idea of dynamic. From my world, the old DBA world, you made the report, you might change the parameters, but the report was there forever. So I'm not saying this is bad, I'm just saying this is new. So again, the idea of the dynamic topology as a default. I think that this is something that is going to only be driven forward by domains, data domains that are changing very rapidly. I happen to be working in one of them, working in genomics, because the price of sequencing and the quality of instruments is increasing faster than Moore's law. And that's creating dynamic data in a way that I've never seen before. Just to give you a very concrete example, one of my clients processes images for cancer biopsies. And they are excited because they have just purchased a new microscope type for a certain tissue type, where previously the resolution of their images, each image was 3 gigabytes to 30 gigabytes. With this new microscope, each image will be 1 terabyte. Now, they're not excited that it's 1 terabyte. They're excited about the image resolution. But I don't think it gets much more dynamic than that. when you have 2 or 3 years later and the image sizes are increasing at that volume. So coming back to this governance idea, the idea is that you have a centralized governance team. I think every organization has that, making sure that it's domain and platform stakeholders. I don't think that's really new news. So, and on the team, you should have people from the domain, people from the platform, subject matter experts. I think that's kind of similar to domain experts, facilitators and managers, and that's similar to platform owners. So the scale obviously works in very large organizations. The organizations I work in, those are kind of redundant roles. And they should have guiding values of localizing decisions, responsibility close to the source. So in other words, it's a fancy way of saying you have to have top level buy-in. This is a significant change to the way data is governed. And if you don't have top level buy-in, it's not going to be successful, which again is not new, but it's important to be reminded. So then she talks about what's an example of top level concerns. And she uses GDPR, which has it's part of the law that the data has to have the right to be forgotten. So that would be an example. An example from my world would be the privacy of patient records, the absolute privacy, limited only to authorized viewers. And then she goes on to talk about globalizing decisions that facilitating interoperability. So she says, she's kind of talking about, she first goes over the things that she sees that you're going to need to standardize on, so that you can kind of see that as a subset of the governance. Just like you have to have these things, but anything beyond these things, you really want to try to push down. So standardize. She makes some examples, like in this particular case, inclusion of particular dimensions, so time, standardization of date and time format, standardization of how date and time is represented in queries for this particular use case. Other examples would be, ones from my world would be patient schema. There's a standardized schema for medical records in the United States, and there's different ones in different countries. So there are certain aspects of the domain that it makes sense to standardize on, and defining those is part of this process of federated governance, so that those aspects can be monitored at the top org level.
Are we finding that is not already done? I guess maybe my organization's too small.
Yep.
But we use the same date format in pretty much every database we use. It seems weird to me that we would have the same data represented, say an employee ID or a name or something else that is stored in, hopefully not 5 different systems, but let's say we have an HR system, we've got a teacher system, we've got a benefits system, and if they all store the data in 5 different standards, that's just... Is this a common thing? It seems like that's another obvious reason.
I was going to say,
it's very common.
As a consultant, it makes me a lot of money.
Yeah,
I mean, it does, and I can see
100%.
with acquisitions and mergers, or you buy 10 different products for 10 different departments, and when you make them all talk to each other, only then do you realize they stored it in 10 different ways. I don't know.
Well, I think where I kind of see it is, you know, and doing these things in a federated way is not like old, right? Like I think lots of large companies had built their own kind of like analytic systems and tried to share data sets with each other, and every one of those kind of groups does things in their own way, right? So this is kind of challenging that like model, because what happens is when these folks try to share data, aside from getting overall like the organizational hurdles, the data is often not compatible, right? You can't join it together. It doesn't have the proper level of detail. The domain keys don't line up. Like somebody's using some weird number for a customer, somebody's using something else, right? So I'd say like companies that have like a centralized data practice, data team, things tend to be more normalized, but I think larger companies definitely not. And as Lynn said, as a consultant, it'll keep you very busy.
Yeah, I think, you know, this is logical, right? Because of the state of things. You can't do this federated computational governance for mesh if you don't have federation, right? So the sort of the underlying thinking here is, if you don't have this, you have to do it first. And yeah, you'd hope that the company has it, but clearly defining what are your federated principles is difficult, even in companies that have it, because you're going to be now enforcing it more formally. That's part of the deal here. A lot of the stuff that was done informally or at, let's say, the table level of a database, or, you know, individual buckets or something, is now going to become code, because we have the concept coming up of policy as code. That you can write tests against it, for example. So it formalizes it. So in order to have a structure that is federated, you have to have that federation at the top. So, and this is really what I was getting to, I guess I was getting a little ahead of myself, local policies and global policies. That's what it really comes to, where the policies around data governance need to be not only written down in English, they need to be executable code policies. So like in the case of Google Cloud, that would be, you know, G Cloud scripts at minimum, or something like Terraform if you're being more formal and using CI/CD. So you would have execute documentation that could be implemented. So bucket security policy, data security, database security policy that matched your definitions of who was managing what. This was kind of interesting. Incentives. I don't know. Data people, I can say, because I am a data person, we're known for having no sense of humor or fun. So I don't know if you gamify data meshes. Maybe. New idea. So applying computation to the governance model. So basically, again, formalizing either verbal data policies or maybe written down documented data policies as implementable code. So standards as code, basically. Policies as code, automated tests against that, and automated monitoring. So treating governance like software. You know, what a concept, right? We're building software. So, you know, the meta aspect of this is infrastructure as code, which, you know, I have yet to find in 12 years as a cloud consultant anybody who gets this totally right, because it's very hard, right? From stopping people from clicking on the console and breaking production to, you know, having inconsistencies because you don't test your infrastructure code. I mean, realistically, how many customers, and I guess I'll ask Elliot this, that you've worked with have had tests for their infrastructure code? Like what %? 5? 2?
Very low. Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, like I think testing of IAC is pretty immature,
Right.
you know, in terms
Right.
of practice and tooling, 100%.
Exactly. And, you know, it's putting this rigor around this so that you can have the ability to push down the control. And in that way, I think she is correct. So policies fall into the standards category. So what would they be? So you would have APIs for discoverability and observability around all your data. And again, that's easier said than done, right? Interfaces, so APIs again, modeling of both the semantics and the query language and lineage. And then identity systems, so which identity systems can be associated. Now, this is really an interesting area in some of the work that I'm doing right now with trying not only to federate within an organization, but between research organizations. So one of the projects that I'm working on is to federate not only between clouds, but between identity systems that are either living in the cloud or that are not living in the cloud, but basically based on researcher access level for cancer data, in my case. So it's a very complex problem space to try to figure this out because, again, it's very immature. There isn't sort of a standard around federated identity. And I know there's identity products like, you know, OAuth and some commercial products as well, but there's not standards that I see. And so of the standards as code, the identity systems is one that I don't run across a lot, but when you run across it, it's a really gnarly problem. I don't know if anybody else has had any work with that. I wonder if Matt has with schools. Do you have, like, is it just a single identity system you work with, or how does that go for schools?
We have a single identity system. Back in the day, you know, before you could allow SSO, you know, people had to memorize 20 different logins, but they weren't integrated anyway, so it didn't matter. But now our particular district, we standardize on Microsoft, but there's plenty that standardize on Google.
Yeah. Okay, so policies as code. Again, one of the things that's interesting here is these policies span services. So in my experience, so and that makes it real tricky to implement. So for example, for data privacy and protection, that would be policies around logging to see the access. And I'll just pick another one around retention. That would be around monitoring the logs around lifecycle policy for buckets. I'm always talking about buckets. Obviously, databases are also in here, so archiving databases. But the idea here is that this list is not available in cloud products as a single set of services. It's all over the place, which makes it really hard to implement it currently. So it'll be really interesting to see what the cloud vendors do here. You know, one of the things, and I guess I'll just switch over so you guys can see this again, sorry. You know, we started looking at Dataplex, which is a set of services to aggregate both buckets and, well, everything that's listed here, right? Buckets, machine learning models, pub sub streams, relational, and analytic tables in BigQuery. So it's basically like one big control plane. So that's the beginning of this kind of thing where you can, you know, manage entire sets. I don't know if you guys remember this from the previous demos where we were looking at working with, you know, lake instances, which can be secured at the level of the resource or at the level of the principal, which is the person. And another thing that's interesting in this area is the product releases are really fast. Since we've started this book club, there's been a major release by Azure of Microsoft Fabric, which is not the same thing as Dataplex, but again, it's starting to address some of these problems of management of multiple data sources across an enterprise. And so this area is very active from the cloud vendors in terms of aggregating the services in a control plane so you can see them in one place rather than going to the service instances.
Is Fabric part of One Lake, or is that another example where Azure is trying to figure out this kind of more federated?
Yeah, I haven't really dug in.
So Fabric is the environment,
Yeah.
is the whole ecosystem. That's
Yeah.
Fabric. One Lake is the storage platform inside of Fabric.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
But one interesting demo they showed that I saw just the other day is they literally had like CSVs, which are files, right?
Right,
They had
right.
databases, and then they had external data sources, could be AWS or something else, but they're all within Fabric. And and they have a Fabric Explorer that is a Windows extension, so it shows up as a shared drive, literally in your folders.
Yep.
And when you browse to it, you can't tell where the data is from. It's just there. If you're opening a CSV, you might be opening a CSV that's sitting in a Azure storage bucket, but on your computer, it looks like any other spreadsheet. It was a really interesting concept. I like the idea from a business point of view. Most of my business people could care less where the data is. That's IT's job to
Right.
right. So I really thought that was interesting.
So this is implemented, this concept of this plane of data by domain, data as product, is implemented in a number of different ways in computational cloud environments. And inside Dataplex, this is using kind of an old technology called the Hive Metastore. This comes from Hadoop, actually, like way back in the day. And the idea is that this is metadata around the data assets. So in order to set up a data lake in Dataplex, which is similar to what Matt was talking about, but the Google version of it, basically, you have to set up this metastore so that the metadata about the resources has a central location. That's like the magic under the hood, basically. And Fabric has a similar process. I don't know. I honestly don't know if it's Hive Metastore or what metastore it is. But the idea is a metadata database that is highly available. So it's managed for you. So, you know, obviously replicated and all that. So you don't have to worry about it going down. So it's not magic. There is a database of data information behind the scenes.
Does that mean the way Matt is just explaining that whatever sources, whatever has been combined to the pan in the Fabric is pulled up there in the meta store? Does that mean that?
It means the paths to it. So like here I have set this up in a different project, and inside of this genomics lake, there are zones. Remember I was showing this, and the zones are basically, in this case, buckets, right? If I wanted to add assets to the zone, the types of assets that are supported in Google are BigQuery datasets or buckets. And it varies by how the service is set up, the data, I don't know if we want to call it data mesh service, whether it's Fabric or Dataplex. And then depending on what you're setting up, the information that you're putting in here is going into the metadata data store. So, and remember how we were talking about labels in earlier sessions, because labels are used around policies. Labels are used when you're, assessing data quality, for example, data quality scans. When you're securing, you can secure at the level of the label rather than at the level of the bucket, for example. The whole idea is to give metadata around data assets so you can group them together and get away from working with them at the level of the primitive. Now, for a database, that might seem crazy because you're used to it. You're like, okay, well, I manage my databases. Why do we need this, right? But why it's happening is because of the extension of the data plane into the world of buckets, because it's so difficult to manage buckets when you have thousands of them. Or I've had customers, I think one of my biggest customer, I don't even know how many they had, maybe 50,000 buckets in one project.
Wow.
Yeah. So you obviously need metadata because you can't, and of course that's why we continually see these news stories of private data exposed from a bucket, you know, because it's impossible to manage that. So okay. So then she talked about testing, monitoring should be automated, so treated as software. And once you have that in place, which is not a small thing, then you want to start thinking about the delegation. And that's where the fighting begins, right? Because this is, you know, there's two, I think, fundamentally new concepts here. That the having control at the federated level, that's a discipline that is there for some companies and not for others, which is a different set of problems. That's sort of a starting point. But beyond that, once you have that, then this idea that everything is fluid rather than static is really, really new. And the idea of pushing down the accountability to the domains because data is products is radically new. I've been working in data for, I don't know, 15 years, and I've never really heard before, like, give more control of the data to the owners of the data. I haven't, and I'm not saying it's bad. I'm just saying, you know, software is made by people, and this is going to take some time because you can build it into the products, but people have to get used to this idea of, well, like I always like to say on the application software side, software is soft, right? It should be changeable. And extending that to data is soft. I think that it's going to take a generation actually for this to really get adopted. And maybe I'm just showing my age. I don't know. What does everybody else think? Like this idea of delegating accountability to domains. When you read that, do you go, oh yeah, sure? Do you go, what?
I think the biggest challenge is probably getting back to the reward system. Like as we talk about domains, we're talking about the actual people who, the system owners, people building like the software, right? I think the biggest problem is that, like, how do you make them responsible, right? Like what changes in kind of their reward system, you know, that makes them want to take on this accountability and this work, right?
Yeah.
So, oh, we're responsible for data products now. Yeah, okay, right. But you know, it's gonna be you know, a lot of, and it's elsewhere in this book, obviously, but it's gonna take a lot of work. I don't know if it'll take a generation. I hope not, but to make people kind of understand this new role, and as it pertains to governance, their role in governance, right? Which is two ways, right? They have new responsibility because it's localized, but then they also have some amount of central governance, right? Which is enforced, which, you know, they only have a vote in, perhaps, right? So where otherwise they've been used to autonomy, right? With this software they build.
So here in the book itself, there is a term, I mean, the original meaning of governance being explained as an steering and guiding the vessel. It's not reinforcing or strongly asking some policies to be implemented. So when in these days, governance means something which is very strongly implemented and you are forcibly following something. So she's just saying that originally she would just take it to the original meaning of governance, that what it should be. So that's softly taking us towards the exact path to take. She's emphasizing to take that gentle way and not, you know, emphasizing on the rules being made and implemented.
Yeah.
So as per my understanding, when I was just reading this section, and we had this pretty much clear idea what's going on in first or second chapter somewhere when we're talking about the granularity of the data, like small domains and then clubbing up and then interoperability. We were pretty much sure like it is coming up later to the governance. So I see here the mesh is only for the governance and the policy. Data is there, database there, users are here, but actual mesh comes with the policy, which is connecting and equally making the data as a product, that's what they say, is available to all the people who are authorized and probably the right users for the that subject. So the whole lot of concept, actual friction will come to the policy making, and what is enforcing what.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Which domain is dominating the federation? Are they just talking about my thing? I mean, I would say my this domain has got more stronger policies, and this is what I want to keep my data strong, which is somewhere overriding the central one, somewhere, the federation one. So actual friction will come there.
Probably. Exactly. Well, again, and I wanted to talk about some of this real world stuff that I'm encountering with my clients, because again, I think it gives more color to this. So as you were just saying, embedding the policy execution in each data product is a key aspect of this. So what is that policy execution? And one thing she does not cover in this chapter that I think is an important consideration, important omission, is data classification. Because this is not a given, and every customer that I've worked with, every customer, whether it's any domain, they're going to have more success with this kind of stratification of governance if they have a concept of classification of data. And very simply, you're going to start with public data and secret data, right? And this is a very known process, but I'm surprised at how few customers have done this. And I think it's actually critical before you go down this process, because most of the cloud vendors are building for 4 levels of data, not just public or secret. It's public or authorized, partner only, or private, corporate, inside the corporation only, right? I mean, I'm kind of like just buzzing on some of the in between, because it's going to have to be defined by the organization. But I think that's a key aspect of being able to implement this multi-leveled governance that she doesn't discuss at all. And I can't understand how you would do this. And I'm actually running into this with some of my customers because they haven't done it. And then they can't really think of policies if they haven't created formal definitions for the types of data. So I think it's a big omission, and I wanted to call it out. I'm curious if anybody else has any experience, like if Matt, you have this at schools. Do you have just student data or public data? Do you have multiple levels in between?
We probably have multiple levels. We have data that's, available for the public. We call that directory information that we can release. We have data that we can release to individual vendors. And then we have data internally. We have data that HR or special ed can see, but a teacher cannot. And being in California and being some of the laws and things that have passed, it is really interesting that there are certain data the student is allowed to tell us that we are not legally allowed to disclose to the parent. And so the databases are having to catch up to that.
Right.
Because how do you store that in a system so that a teacher sees what they're supposed to see, yet a parent sees what they're supposed to see, and then a guidance counselor sees something else? So this is something the vendors are having a hard time catching up with. But I agree, until we can classify that data internally, it'll be hard to get policies around it that are governing it and automating it, for us.
Yeah. Well, to be fair, there are some products, and I can't remember if I showed you guys DLP or not, but DLP in Google Cloud is awesome. And there's again, everything I'm showing you, there's some version of this in the other clouds. I just have been mostly working here. This is a scanning tool where you can define the risks that your data could cause, and you can either do one-time scans or you can, to this point, you can set up regular scans to help with observability and compliance, and you can define the types of data. These types of services are relatively new. Again, they used to be third-party products, and the vendors are now providing them. And notice they also include de-identification, which in my bioinformatics use case is awesome because that used to be a manual task, right? And things like this are much better automated because humans, if they're writing scripts to do it, can miss edge cases where, not that these services will never do that, but there was less of a likelihood, right? So these services set up as part of your observability, running regular jobs, is a relatively new pattern because the services weren't available, but I think it's a key part of this data policies and data classification that I'm working to build with my customers already. So anyway.
Out of curiosity, how do you feel about, this concept of a policy? Do we feel it's mostly reactive in terms of observability and monitoring,
Yes,
at least the way it is now, right? Yeah, I agree.
I do. I think that, yep, exactly. Well said. Then, you don't want to forget that this is data. So measuring the network effect. I actually ran into this week where we were moving data between systems, and we got a little message from our cloud vendor. This is not only from a security aspect, but it's part of the monitoring. It depends on your domain, but again, it's just my world. Embracing change again, good luck with that. And talking about systems thinking and getting this federated team. So one thing that I wanted to add to her discussion as well is this idea of how do you organize your entire resources in the cloud. And this is something that I think is poorly understood because I'm just going to give you a little history lesson here. In the beginning, there was Amazon, and there were buckets, and there were EC2 instances. And this is a Google view of it, but in the beginning, you went to Amazon, you signed in, you made buckets, and you made EC2 instances. And yes, they are physically in data centers, US East or whatever, but you didn't have a concept of these boxes or these containers around the resources. And this whole idea of resource hierarchies has evolved. I mean, this is not unlike a resource hierarchy of your on-prem resources where you have Active Directory, for example, and you have, organizational units. However, in the cloud, this came after. It came sort of the opposite way. Like the services were there first. And to this day, and Elliot and I can have an arm wrestle on this one, I don't think Amazon has as good of a story here as Azure or Google, because they started with resources and then added on the ability to organize them so you could apply policies at a higher level. Whereas Google and Microsoft started with a concept of either you can work in an individual project if you're just kind of trying things out, or more typically, you will set up an organization and then you will create folders, not to put files in, but for policies that can then be applied. So this is how you apply federated data policies. This is how you do your design. And the reason I wanted to bring this up, because I'm actually working on a design right now. That's literally what I'm doing. And it's a really difficult challenge in this new idea of data mesh because the patterns are not there. Thinking about what is going to be federated, because at each level you can have different levels of policy based on the needs. So you have to really understand the domain. This is a multi-level policy. So to put some concrete to it, like Department X just has certain policy, company has policy needs. So those are applied at the global level. Department X has policy needs that have to include all the company ones, but could allow for certain capabilities that are used in Department X. Department Y consists of multiple teams that have different policy needs. The reason you make this levels of folders is for different policies. And then team B has different products going on. And within the products, you then get down to the level of the project. And just to keep it real, a project is one of these things. This is a project that it's a project as a container for services. So it's like creating an on-premise network with all the resources, but harder.
So I guess this approach, what you're taking is, this is, however we are considering it, the old school model, but this looks like this is more achievable, more sorted, because we know the flow. Somewhere we have to, like when we are talking about the federation, it should be starting from the company level.
Yep.
Right. And
yep.
And there we can find the flow. How would it go? And what is actually inherited and what else has to be added. This picture somewhere, some kind of picture similar to this should be included in the book somewhere. For our more clarity, because like the situations we have, like a very practical situation what Matt is dealing with, like many things together, clubbing up, and then finding reports, and then there's a good mismatch and data type and privacy. So such thing will at least give us a clear idea from where what policy should be applied and what else has to be added, and which certain product is nowhere interoperable. There are situations where you don't want to do that. Data is solely private. You can only fetch some part of it, solely cannot be shared. There are so many things, and especially the way things are moving, especially in the fintech and the medical systems, things are very private. And even in the school systems, many of these things are private. Now we know that privacy policy here. So if such kind of picture has been added somewhere in the book, it makes more sense.
And that's what I was thinking. So yeah. Let me just take Matt's case, because this is an interesting case, I think. So he has to deal with changes in law, right, around student data. And one of the policies that this could represent is basically like a software firewall, which is called a virtual private cloud, a VPC. And what could happen is certain types of data could be required for a security audit to be within a certain firewall boundary or VPC boundary. And if that changes, then unfortunately, if you have set this up, you might be forced to set up an alternate organization. And that's in fact what happened to a recent client of mine, because law changed. It was around health. But so it's a fundamental that you do as best you can. But again, I just wanted to share it because they're not the only client this has happened to. In fact, this happens to more clients than not when they try to use organizations, especially if they're new to cloud. The first organization they set up, they don't get all the federated requirements, and they end up having to set up a second organization. So what I tell clients who are coming into cloud with any projects, but we'll say data projects for this discussion, is although when you get a trial account for Google, they have the organization and you just get a project. So if you sign up and you want to learn Google Cloud, you don't see the organization or the policies because you've got a little trial. That's not necessarily the best way to learn if you're us. You might want to take the time to set up an organization so that you can understand how it works, because it's something I see done incorrectly before all this data mesh stuff all the time. And now reading about this federated governance and then having this recent experience, I was reminded. And so I wanted to, use this opportunity to basically share so other people could avoid this pain. I am quite curious in Amazon. I'm not honestly up to date on this. I know they have organizations. And Elliot, I don't mean to put you on the spot, but do you have you had any similar experience like this with organizations?
Yeah, for sure. Actually doing an organization designs and one of my current clients right now, and it's similar. I don't think it has the layers in the cake like Google does, where we're going down to like kind of project resource kind of visibility. But yeah, like the yellow part is similar. I guess like coming back to like our subject, that this is like data policies. I don't see a strong intersection in the Amazon organizational structure and like applying and inheriting those rules. I don't know if it's different in Google. Like the way that Amazon handles it is outside. It's in lake formation and now it's data zone as it's being launched. So like does what we'd hope would be a data policy apply in this hierarchy, or is it separate in Google?
Well, it depends on what you define as data policy. So
there's a bunch. It's
right.
a bunch of different stuff.
So I'll make you an example. There's a certain policy around a VPC service controls, and that is a part of the data policy at one of the clients that I work with, and that is enforced at the company level. And so what that results in is only defined VPCs can be used in anything downstream. And all the examples and samples for Google Cloud use the default VPC, which by policy cannot be used in this organization, which has
100% right.
Which has resulted in a lot of pain when people are trying to learn, because number one, they can't use any tutorial, and number two, there are actually services in Google, including some data services, that do not work with a non-default VPC.
Wow. That's interesting.
Yeah. And so we've had to go to Google, and in some cases, they've actually extended the services and added the feature. So, I mean, that's just one sort of example from the real world. The other thing that's interesting about Google is some capabilities are only available at the organizational level. And a lot has to do with observability and logging by tags. And that does associate to, because if you remember back to Dataplex, one of the ideas is you can do, your processing, your data quality by tag, right? And you'll see over here that, at the level of the organization, the idea is to create the tagging hierarchy, which then you can enforce by policy. So I think Amazon's pretty strong in tagging, because that's what they used before they had this.
Yeah.
It was all tags, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is, I agree. Certain things that we would consider data policies are at the org level and inherited the way you expect, even in Amazon, right? So depends on what you call a data policy. If we're talking about, security for sure,
right?
That's part of why you use orgs, right?
Right.
So,
exactly. So again, she completely left out quite a lot of pragmatic stuff in this chapter. So that's why I wanted to kind of supplement with some of the real world experience that I've had, because it's a key part of the implementation. I mean, we have more to go on it, but just because I'm actually working with some of the stuff, I thought, hey, where's that?
It's lovely. Yeah.
Yeah. So we are at the top of the hour, and we got through a chapter. Woohoo! So enough of me. Well, we're going to be meeting in a couple of weeks, and so I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
Yeah.